Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And in particular, I'd like to focus our attention on a recent collector set or box set release that was made by Criterion. The set itself overall has been designated SPY number 1103, but there are a number of films included in such set. And so I'd very much like to focus our attention today on one of those films. And it is a film from 1991. And it is from the filmmaker Tsui Hark. And I should say too that it is located in this set. The set is called Once Upon a Time in China, The Complete Films. And the film that I'd like to focus our attention on today is the work which is called, in Chinese, Wong Fei Hung, or in English, Once Upon a Time in China. Extraordinary work from 1991, and it has in its wonderful, incredible cast people like Jet Li and Rosamund Kwan and Yan Shi Kwan and Yuan Biao and Jackie Chun Hok Yao and Kent Chang and others. And it is from the great filmmaker Tsui Hark. And once again, it is from 1991, and it is known in the Cantonese language as Wong Fei Hung, or it is known in English as Once Upon a Time in China. Now, I should point out that the Cantonese language title of Wong Fei Hung is quite significant in a number of respects, I think not least of which being the fact that this is a story or plot or film that is about, or that is involving, or that is otherwise revolving around the main character of Wong Fei Hung, who is this historical figure, an immensely popular figure both in history and society and culture, and also in sort of popular folklore, both in terms of the historical background as well as depictions of this legendary character in various forms, including various films that have been made throughout the history of cinema. In particular, from the late 1940s into the 1960s and then into the late 1970s, leading up to this particular version or interpretation or reinterpretation or homage to the legend, the story, and the personage and character and life that is of this extraordinary figure of Wong Fei Hung, here portrayed by Jet Li. And so we have the beginning, if you will, of the adventures of Wong Fei Hung, again in the personage of Jet Li, at least for a certain number of the films going forward in this set. And of course, where there might be some changes, we will again bring those up when they are appropriate. But for right now, we are in this mode of cinema, 1991, in the hands of Tsui Hark and company, with this film, Wong Fei Hung, or Once Upon a Time in China. And going to the plot or story of this film, again, focusing our attention on the character of Wong Fei Hung, we know that this is a story that is set in or around the late 19th century, and this is China, and this is the Qing Dynasty era of China. And to be even more specific, we understand this is in or around the year of 1875, and the place is Foshan, China. And this place is very important for a number of reasons, because we know that Wong Fei Hung is focused here in this particular place. He is practicing medicine of a certain sort, acupuncture and also bone setting and the like, through his apothecary medical center school, which is known as Po Chi Lam, again in this area. And we also know that he has a number of disciples that we meet along the way, the various characters that make up this environment, this setting, this group of friends and associates that we will get to know very, very well as the films progresses, and as indeed this particular film progresses. For instance, we meet one of the disciples known as So, or known affectionately as Bucktooth So. We also meet another disciple called Wing, or Butcher Wing. And we meet a number of other characters along the way that form part of this particular group or setting or particular circumstances that make up this first film, Once Upon a Time in China. For instance, the circumstances that lead to, say, the introduction of the character of Leung Fun, here played by Yuan Biao, and in this particular film played by Yuan Biao. And we see the circumstances of his arrival into this particular area of Foshan and how he ends up meeting the people of Pochilam, including, of course, Wang Feiheng. So that's one character that we will get to meet quite well, I should say, in the course of this film, and perhaps even in the other films to follow. Another similarly situated character, in the sense that we get to know very well throughout the course of this film, and perhaps we will get to know very well throughout the course of the other films, is the character played by Rosamund Kwan, who is known as 13th Aunt, or Aunt number 13, Aunt 13 Xiu Quan. And her character is very, very important for a number of reasons. One of the main focal points of this particular film and the series is the relationships, the various relationships that Wang Feiheng has with all of these various characters that we meet, many of whom we meet in this particular film. One of those key relationships is, of course, the relationship between Wang Feiheng and Aunt number 13, Xiu Quan. She is someone who we understand has been educated abroad, and now she is returning to China, and she is meeting or re-meeting or reuniting with Wang Feiheng. And there is a sense of a type of maybe familial dynamic, because they are said to be distant relatives, but there is also a type of spark of attraction or potential romance between the two of them. But there is also a sense of maybe familial duty, or maybe something akin to sort of Confucian dynamic ethics that prevent any type of intimacy, at least from the outset. And so there's a type of distance that is occurring, hence the maintaining of the name of 13th Aunt, or Aunt number 13. But this is a type of, I wouldn't say running joke per se, but a type of theme that we can say is maybe introduced in this particular film, and will be seen carrying itself forward. And it's an example of the type of, say, setup in a sense of a Confucian hierarchical dynamic, in particular in the way that Wang Feiheng views the particular relationships and the world. For example, how he views the relationship with Aunt number 13, Rosamund Kwan character, and how this particular so-called strict Confucian dynamic will change or evolve or progress over the course of time, and how that forms or how that otherwise informs the particular character of Wang Feiheng. And this is also a very important theme that I will try to touch upon a little bit more as we get into maybe some of the supplements that are part of this particular disc of Once Upon a Time in China. But that's another theme that comes into play when we see the introduction of this particular character, again in the context of the story or plot. Another reason why the 13th Aunt relationship is very important is the fact that she is, we understand, coming from abroad, or she is educated abroad, and she is seen oftentimes in this film dressed in sort of Western garb or Western clothing. She is also speaking languages. She's speaking languages other than Chinese. She can be said to be speaking, she understands the English language. She also has a camera with her, which is a very, in this particular part, of history. It's seen as a type of technological marvel or mysterious technological feat that she is very attached to, and that she is showing various people in Foshan in this particular area, including Wang Feiheng, I should add. And so this becomes an example or a theme of how she seems to be representing certain aspects of Western culture, or the idea of cultural influences outside of China during this time of the late 19th century Qing dynasty, but that are seemingly finding their way or penetrating their way into the very daily fabric lives of the people, as exemplified in this community of Foshan. And we see, therefore, the idea of the emerging of certain themes or concepts or ideals, and perhaps even linked to ideals of emancipation or democracy, as well as technological advancements, as exemplified in 13th Aunt and her attachment to this particular piece of technology, which is the camera. And so this becomes a theme which we see introduced, I think, quite vividly in this film, namely the type of interaction between the traditions and roles of Chinese society at this time, as exemplified in sort of Confucian ideals and also martial arts, and we'll get to that in a second, in particular the vein of martial arts that is practiced by Wang Feiheng and his disciples, which is known as Honggar Kung Fu. And so we see this exemplified and representing a type of mode or representation of a type of Chinese society and culture on the one hand, but then we see how that interacts or clashes or collides or perhaps otherwise forms or melds or mixes with influences from outside of the country, including influences that are represented by the character of Rosamund Kwan's 13th Aunt, and what she represents as far as her education and her background, and also what she represents as far as what she physically brings in terms of the camera and the technological advancements and the like. So already in the discussion of the characters that we meet in Once Upon a Time in China, we are already getting these thematic introductions that are vividly portrayed. And indeed, we will see these blossom and grow and progress and evolve. And we will see various applications of variations on a theme or variations on multiple themes as we get through or as we watch the films in this particular cycle of films, Once Upon a Time in China, the Wang Feiheng series of films from Tsui Hark. But here we get them introduced and firmly established. And my goodness, they are established with such strength and style and verve that they, I think they enmesh or they mix very well with the other themes that are also emerging as we think about the plot or story or structure. As we recall, we are focusing in on Wang Feiheng and his particular set of circumstances. They also involve his dealings with particular, say, rival infighting or factional infighting that is seen to be occurring in this particular area of Foshan, and that's seen represented in a number of different modes of the plot. First, there is this gangland rivalry kind of warfare that's going on. There's a rival gang that seems to be encroaching or threatening certain aspects of Pochilam, the Shaho gang, and the types of violence and the types of hijinks and situational circumstances that drive the plot forward in terms of the clashes and the fighting, and indeed the opportunity to see martial arts excitement and action on display so vividly and so filled with a lot of energy, as we see, for instance, certain clashes between Wang Feiheng and his people and his disciples on the one hand, and these encroaching gangs and these threatening gangs on the other. And so that's, or these gang members on the other, I should say. And that is not all in terms of the factional infighting. There's also the introduction of a martial arts master. And this is Master Yim, or known also as Iron Vest Yim. And he seems to be wanting to establish his own, say, school or his own his own type of presence, and that he also shows his incredible martial arts display and technique, and it's a technique that is very nuanced, and it's very keyed in on some specific details that emerge as we see more of that technique on display. But while we see that technique on display, it also is an indication that we will see these various clashes of, say, martial arts fighting, but also martial arts philosophies that we see exemplified in, say, that philosophy which is expressed by Master Yim on the one hand, and then also that martial arts philosophy which is exemplified or expressed by Wang Feiheng on the other. And you know that there is going to be a clash between these two. And when that clash happens, my goodness, it's one of the great martial arts spectacles of this particular era of Hong Kong cinema, and indeed of cinema itself. And it's one of the highlights of this film, and indeed the cycle of films from Tsui Hark, Once Upon a Time in China. Yan Shi-kwan plays Master Yim, and his martial arts prowess and his type of almost venomous energy is one of the driving forces of this film. And as I say, it's that tension and that suspense with that knowledge that you know that there's going to be a collision course between these two titans of martial arts energy and philosophy, that being Master Yim and then the other being Wang Feiheng, again the Jet Li character. So that's another source of tension and excitement and levels of plot in this film. Yet another level of plot in this film involves a certain type of intrigue and a certain type of examination of the sort of levels or echelons of power and influence, and how we have the sort of the governor, gubernatorial governor level or municipal rule or authority as expressed in Foshan, sort of the Chinese authorities, as it were, and we see how they are relating to the people, or maybe their lack of understanding to the people, as expressed, say, in the governor's or in the authorities' relationship with Wang Feiheng. And there's this type of almost antagonism, which seems to be somewhat inexplicable on the one hand, but perhaps it is not so inexplicable, perhaps because it might be suggestive of this late 19th century Qing dynasty governmental, bureaucratic type of rot or decay that seems to be eroding and making way, or is beginning to show signs of eroding in light of emerging democratic or emancipatory principles and ideals that are emerging. Again, I mentioned the character of Rosamund Kwan's 13th aunt and what she seems to be representing just by virtue of her background and also her interests. Not just the idea of what she brings in terms of extraterritorial and cultural aspects outside of China, camera, her Western dress, etc., her ability to speak the language of English, etc., but also what she seems to represent in terms of emancipation and principles of democracy. And when we think about that in the context of Qing dynasty government bureaucratic events, and a type of maybe sense of even to the sense of corruption, as exemplified in many of the plot structures in this film, and indeed in other films. We'll see it in particular play itself out very vividly in films like Once Upon a Time in China 2 and Once Upon a Time in China 3. But here in Once Upon a Time in China, we do see that dynamic, I think, expressed very well, and also played into that idea of the depiction of government is the way in which high government officials are interacting with, on a diplomatic and political level, with non-Chinese actors or non-Chinese representatives from countries outside of China, European countries, etc., and how those interactions seem to also bring to focus or bring to the fore this notion of a type of potential, say, clash or dilemma or question about how China will deal or must deal or is going to deal with the ever sort of the ever-present, say, role of the outside world, the idea of, to put it in very broad terms, East and West, or the idea of the outside influences, and how China will either reject those outside influences or how they will accept them or adapt to them based on certain circumstances that we see arise. And sometimes it's not an easy relationship. And we see that also exemplified in how specifically the Jet Li character of Wang Feiheng, how he seems to be, on the one hand, somewhat hesitant in terms of his initial responses and reactions to various aspects of outside influence, as it were. As I say, we see his initial reticence towards the camera that Rosamund Kwan's 13th aunt had, and there's a particular scene where there's a very intense, maybe battle, or in a very intense emotional moment that happens to Wang Feiheng and Po Chi Lam. And we see how he is very much reacting against Rosamund Kwan's, her attachment to the camera. And that seems to be an indication, I think very subtly, or maybe not so subtly, of how maybe at that particular moment he is seen to be rejecting this aspect of the camera, which is sort of a technology that is from outside of China. It seems to be thematically representing something that is outside of China. Another thing, too, that is seen to be something that China, and particularly Wang Feiheng and Po Chi Lam, and indeed the spirit of martial arts and Master Yim, etc., will need to deal with, for better or for worse, will need to deal with, is the emergence of military technology, guns and ammunition, and how this is seen to be somewhat, or not somewhat, quite an intense, maybe threat or risk or danger to that which seems otherwise to be, in terms of this film anyway, a representation of the spirit or soul of China, namely the way in which the characters express themselves through martial arts. So we have this expression of the sort of soul or spirit on the one hand, and how this is potentially under threat with the emerging military technology, the army, the armed guards, the soldiers of nations outside of China that seem to be, at a moment's notice, just firing their guns and putting people in sort of harm's way. And it's dealt with sometimes maybe humorously, sometimes not so humorously in this film, but in any event, it becomes this very strong theme of, again, East and West, or tradition versus modernization, or the soul as expressed via martial arts versus the idea of the emergence of even stronger and more dangerous aspects of military technology, guns, etc., and how characters like Wang Feiheng and indeed Master Yim and others, how they will adapt to this, if they are able to adapt at all. Will they be able to express themselves in a almost quote-unquote pure, authentic way in terms of their martial arts, or will they need to adapt and strengthen and protect themselves using other techniques that might not otherwise be said to be quote-unquote pure or authentic? And so these are the types of questions that I think touch upon very vividly and very astutely a type of philosophical nature of the soul and spirit and character of a particular nation as expressed through the martial arts. And this is a very key aspect. So it becomes, therefore, the martial arts in this film becomes very much philosophical, as well as being an incredible source of entertainment in the action scenes, etc. And it's all intertwined in terms of history and culture and society. Again, late 19th century, and how this is front and center, or at the very heart of the almost dueling dynamics that are existing: East-West, tradition, modernity, martial arts versus an emerging military technology, and the idea of type of one's expression through the soul or spirit, and how one needs to adapt, or how one fails to adapt in the face of emerging external pressures from the outside, and all wrapped within the story, or the story arcs, or the various situations centered around, or involving, or revolving around, or otherwise focused on this key character of Wang Feiheng, played by Jet Li. So there is so much that is going on within the particular leveling or levelings of this film, as well as being a top-notch entertainment of this particular type of film, or indeed of cinema, period. This is a highly entertaining film that is filled with vigor, energy. There's a type of rousing spirit of entertainment and engagement, and the set pieces are just stunning. They are out of this world. They are creative. And they are all helped along by the wonderful music. There's a great theme, a very famous theme that opens the film and that is punctuating various aspects of the film, and indeed the series overall. And we'll get to that maybe a little bit later in this discussion. And also the performances, too, are really helping to cater what is one of the great strengths of this film, namely the way in which we meet the characters and also how we will engage with the characters and the various relationships that exist. These characters are characters that we will meet again and again through various forms and formations, but we will meet them again and again. And of course, Wang Fei-hung is a character that we will see throughout the entire cycle of films, but we'll see other characters as well. Leung Foon, we'll see 13th Aunt, we'll see some of the other disciples, as well as some other faces that will emerge along the way. But it is these relationships that I think we should it'll be really fun to keep an eye on as we watch the films, because their various changes or the various, say, different situations that will confront them as we go from film to film to film is indeed a further opportunity to see how these themes that are already established in this first film, Once Upon a Time in China or Wang Fei-hung, how they will indeed blossom or change direction or create variations on a particular theme, or likewise how they will progress as the characters progress through history and through the various situations that emerge along the way. And it all begins here with an explosive dynamism and high entertainment value that is going to be sustained throughout the cycle of these films in various forms and modes. But we see it with great vigor and great excitement and energy as expressed here in this first film from 1991 from Tsui Hark. This is the work starring Jet Li as Wang Fei-hung. It's known in Cantonese as Wang Fei-hung, known in English as Once Upon a Time in China. So the Criterion Collection has released this film, Wang Fei-hung, or Once Upon a Time in China, the first film from 1991, as one of the films that's included in this particular Blu-ray set. The set itself overall is given, as I said earlier, spine number 1103. Each of the films is not given its own spine number, but the set overall is. But we should point out that there are a number of films and each is given its own disc. So there are a total of 6 Blu-ray discs. On the first of such discs is the film Once Upon a Time in China, plus a number of supplements that are, one can say, associated with this film, but perhaps they are associated with the cycle of films overall. And so we will talk about those supplements momentarily. I should point out that this film is on this Criterion set purported to be based on the 4K digital restoration of this film. And I should just read from the credits here, which is in the final page of the booklet, about the transfers. All 5 films are presented in their original aspect ratio of 2.39:1. The 4K digital restorations of the first 3 were undertaken by Fortune Star Media Limited from transferred created on Aeroscan film scanner from the 35mm original camera negatives. Once Upon a Time in China and Once Upon a Time in China 2 were restored at perfect production in Hong Kong, etc., etc. So we are dealing with the restoration versions of these particular films. We have the 4K for purposes of this Blu-ray set and for purposes of the first film, Once Upon a Time in China. So I should point out that this film, and indeed a number of the other films, they've been released on a number of various prior releases on physical media and now indeed on streaming. And so you can watch, for instance, past DVD releases. There have been past Blu-ray releases. There's been a really great release, for instance, almost recently, very recently, about a year or so ago, from the great people, the great team at Eureka, in terms of what they refer to, or what is referred to as the Once Upon a Time in China trilogy, included in which is, of course, the first film. And so you have a number of great options, including, I might add, the Eureka option. If you're looking for a great presentation, I think the Eureka option is a way to go. And indeed, if you already have the Eureka set, I would say it's probably worthwhile to hold on to that. Because, as I will mention briefly, there are a number of supplements and a number of options that one can find in the Eureka set that one cannot find, for instance, in the Criterion set. And that could be said to be one of the weaknesses of the Criterion set. But I should say, too, just before I forget that, although one can say that there are a number of weaknesses in this Criterion set, I think the strengths of this Criterion set are overall incredibly overwhelming. Just before I forget, and I will mention this when we talk about the films Once Upon a Time in China 4 and Once Upon a Time in China 5, but the main attractions, the main reasons why this set overall is incredibly strong from Criterion is, among other reasons, the inclusion of Once Upon a Time in China 4 and Once Upon a Time in China 5, and the treatment of those films in the context of the whole cycle of films Once Upon a Time in China, rather than treating them just as a trilogy, thinking of the films overall, including 4 and 5, and indeed including sometimes referred to as 6, but it's that Once Upon a Time in China and America, which is also included in this set, by the way. And so, just to make a long story short, and again, I'll try to make these details more detailed as we go along with this particular video and other videos. But just to let you know that we do have this particular release now. It is the restoration version, and so there might be some differences in terms of past releases, prior pre-restoration versions that might be seen on DVD elsewhere. And so maybe for some people, the other past release versions or the other maybe prior pre-restoration versions might be preferable. I should note that when I saw this film for the first time a number of years back, I was used, of course, to the version prior to the restoration that we now see on, for instance, here in this Criterion set, for example. And so I note that the restoration version has, for example, a number of scenes, especially in the beginning, where you have the opening credits on the beach. It's very famous, and the theme song, is performed by George Lamb, is blasting in this wonderful rendition, and you have the formation of the disciples on the beach, and it's a real rousing thing. In prior versions that I was used to, the sky would be very bright, but now I could tell that it has a slightly golden hue, which seems to be a little bit different than what I remember it. But for me, these particular details, and they emerge here and there in this particular film, Once Upon a Time in China, but to my eye, in terms of the picture quality and what we see in these new restoration versions, I find them overall to be not in any way detrimental to my enjoyment of the film, but in fact they are very they lend to a very pleasant viewing experience for me, at least when we're talking about the first film. There are some differences in some of the restorations that we will see. I should point out in particular when we get to part 3, there are some details of this restoration version that I think are worth noting, especially when compared to prior pre-restoration versions from the past. And so when we get to, as I say, in the third film, I will try to point those out where I can. But for the most part, for this first film anyway, Once Upon a Time in China, while there are some noticeable differences in terms of the video or the picture quality or the picture presentation, the coloring, etc., I find it to be subtle or not, or to an extent where I still find the viewing to be a very pleasant one indeed. Now, as to the sound for this particular Criterion release, we have 2 audio options available. The first is the what's described as being the original Cantonese language mono track, and then the second option being the stereo Cantonese track. And so we understand that this film was originally released in the Cantonese language mono track, and so that's why it's described in the supplements or in the setup menu on this particular disc as being the original. But we also have the option of the stereo, and I should point out that the notes indicate that the stereo mix that's available here, there's been a lot of effort made to try to retain or include as many of the original sound effects for this particular stereo track option. So I think you're going to have a good option either way with those particular choices. I personally prefer the original mono mix because that's probably the mono track, excuse me, because that's the one that I'm used to. I've seen this film a number of times prior to the restoration version, but I know the film through that track, and that's the experiences that I have the most with this film. So I'm okay with the inclusion of this the mono track, and I will watch the film probably for the most part using or relying on the mono track. I should point out that unlike, say, other releases, the Eureka set comes to mind, there are no other language track options available. So I should point out, too, that there aren't any, for Criterion's release, there aren't any, say, Mandarin language tracks options available. There isn't any English dub language track available as well. So for some people, that might be seen to be a weakness of this particular Criterion release. And for the most part, we see that line of availability, or from a point of view, a lack of availability of language tracks throughout this Criterion set. For the most part, there's an interesting development that happens with when we get to Once Upon a Time in China and America. But apart from that, the language track options might be seen to be somewhat limited because we are getting the Cantonese language tracks only. Either the mono track, which were the original release tracks, except for part 3. And so we get also that the options there as well. But we don't get, except for the sixth film, we don't get any other language tracks. And for some people that might be seen to be a weakness, especially when we're compared to past non-Criterion releases like Eureka's, etc. And so that's okay. But for me, I should point out that for this film and indeed for the other films, I know those films, or if I've watched those films many times in the past, based on the original Cantonese language tracks. And so for me, I'm okay with the so-called lack of availability of other language tracks, as long as I can get the Cantonese language tracks, which is what I get with this Criterion release. So I'm perfectly okay with that, but I can understand how some people might feel like that might be said to be a weakness of this particular Criterion set. What I can say that is perhaps a weakness of this set, as exemplified in the first disc with Once Upon a Time in China, is, speaking of the audio options, unfortunately there isn't any option when it comes to commentary track. So there isn't any commentary track available on any of the discs, including the first disc, Once Upon a Time in China. And so that's a shame because, as some of you may know, in other past releases, non-Criterion releases, there have been some really great commentary track work. For example, there has been some commentary track work, for instance, from Bey Logan, but also quite recently with the Eureka release, Arne Venema and Mike Leader. And so there's some really great stuff on those commentary tracks. And so if you, for instance, if you have the Eureka set, if you want to have a type of approach of completeness when it comes to Once Upon a Time in China, then I suggest that you keep the Eureka. Ideally, have both sets, including this Criterion set, because, as I say, one of the weaknesses of the Criterion set is, unfortunately, the lack of commentary tracks. It would have been really great if Criterion was able to, say, get some of those prior created ones, or maybe create their own. If they had created their own, wow, this set would have been just, I mean, it's already through the roof, but it would just been even more through the roof. So, but in any event, that could be seen as one of the weaknesses. We don't get any commentary tracks for any of the films, including, unfortunately, for Disc 1, Once Upon a Time in China. So that might be incentive to keep some of your other past Once Upon a Time in China releases if you can. But I will say, again, just as a heads up, I will say that the strengths of this set, I think, are incredible. They far, I think, they are make the purchase of the set, I think, necessary for anyone who's a fan of Once Upon a Time in China. Primarily, it's the inclusion of 4 and 5. The inclusion of 4 and 5 on these Blu-ray discs, they are the 2K restorations, or purported to be based on 2K restorations. And I say we will get to those when we talk about 4 and 5 in separate video discussions. But the inclusion of those films is worth the price of the set, and it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So that's the reason, or that's one of the reasons why the Criterion set is so great as it is. But other reasons why the set is so great is also because of, for instance, the supplements that are included here. Again, we don't get all of the supplements that have ever been created for the Once Upon a Time in China film releases. And so if you want to have a sense of completeness, then I suggest that you try to keep your prior releases of the films. They've been released sometimes as trilogies plus the 6th film, etc. Eureka comes to mind as a recent example. So if you want completeness when it comes to all the supplements, keep all of those releases, or as many of the releases as you can as possible. However, when we're thinking about the Criterion release, say in the context of disc 1, we get a number of great supplements, and I think their inclusion their inclusion is so important, and I'll try to explain why. Now, the first of these supplements is a new discussion, a one-on-one discussion with the filmmaker, the producer-director, the writer-producer-director, a filmmaker extraordinaire, Tsui Hark. And this is called A New Interpretation. And this is from 2021 with Criterion. It's approximately 15 minutes. Again, this is the first supplement on the first disc of this set. This is amazing. This is really amazing. It's always great to hear from Tsui Hark and his viewpoint and his perspectives. And here we get his perspectives on Wang Feiheng and the historical figure and the popular icon, the cinematic icon that is Wang Feiheng, leading up to Tsui Hark's interpretation of the person and the character in this film, Wang Feiheng, Once Upon a Time in China, and the rest of the films as well. And so he's talking, for instance, about aspects of fantasy and movements of history, and also the evaluation of roots and culture. And also he brings up something very important, which is we have to remember that this is a film, this and the other films were made in the early part of the 1990s, and they are from Tsui Hark and Company. And so there's the Hong Kong cinema movement and spirit, and Tsui Hark, we know, is from this generation of filmmakers that found a lot of success in the Hong Kong film industry leading up to say this film and others, both critical and commercial success. But we also have to understand that because of its placement in history in the early 1990s, this is also leading up to the key year for Hong Kong, which is 1997, and the handover and this relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. And this Tsui Hark and indeed Tony Rayns in the other supplement, will remind us about how this was in the air. This is something that is very much part of the discussion, and this is something that is on the minds of everyone, filmmakers and also audience members and the like. And so to watch films like Once Upon a Time in China, the first film, and indeed the other films as well, with this idea in mind, I think makes us realize that embedded within the very fabric of these films are a type of, say, comments or commentaries on the nature of, say, sort of a culture and society and people as it's trying to grapple with outside forces, the idea of adapting to outside forces and what that will mean to one's own individual character or spirit. We see that in the context already in the first film, as I say, Wang Feiheng and Company, how they're trying to deal with the outside forces, both in forces that might be seen to be beneficial, as we see a lot of things in the with the character of the 13th Odd, and also things that might might be said to be very dangerous and very risky and very threatening, like the emergence of military technology, or some of the characters that have this maybe this seedy or very dark type of undercurrent to their particular plot or character arc. Speaking of the first film, there's this idea of slave trade, etc., with regard to one of the characters, and so it's not meant to exemplify the entirety of the non-Chinese characters, of course. But my point is that there are both threats and risks, as well as rewards and benefits to this idea of adapting to external pressures from outside. And I think that type of explanation, or that type of discussion of a thematic, cinematic level, I think has its roots or has its foundations also in the current discussion of Hong Kong and its relationship with the mainland pre-1997 or leading up to 1997. And this is hinted at, or this is mentioned by Tsui Hark here, and it's a really key reminder of how current and how valuable this film is as a piece of sort of cultural currency, as well as being a work of art and a great piece of entertainment and exploration of martial arts, and also a continuation of the cinematic cultural hero that is Wong Fei-hung. Now, speaking of Wong Fei-hung, Tsui Hark also mentions the types of his influences and why he wanted to make a Wong Fei-hung film in the first place. And we have to remember, Wong Fei-hung was not just a historical figure. I mean, it's sometimes I've heard mentioned how his sort of stock, his popularity in terms of his historical significance is very much akin to, say, maybe the United States' maybe cultural view of a historical figure there, like, say, Abraham Lincoln. And so there is this huge type of cultural following and admiration for this highly popular, iconic figure, this real-life figure of Wong Fei-hung. Now, as a result, we have seen, or Tsui Hark reminds us, that Wong Fei-hung as a character has been seen in so many works of cinema prior to 1991. And so he mentions the key figure of Kwon Tak-hing. And so Kwon Tak-hing is known as, he's known as, well, he is the actor who played the character of Wong Fei-hung in so many films. The number that's been mentioned is around 70, close to 80 films, beginning in 1949. And there was a stretch of films, so many films from 1949 up to about 1961, and made primarily from the filmmaker Wu Peng. So Kwon Tak-hing has this iconic role. Kwon Tak-hing, for a lot of people, is Wong Fei-hung in the cinematic representation of this particular historical figure. And so, as I say, there's this whole bunch of films beginning from around 1949 into 1961, and then there was a type of re-emergence of the Kwon Tak-hing, Wong Fei-hung films around the mid to late 1960s, leading up to 1970. And then we had other representations or other films dealing with the Wong Fei-hung character in some form or another. For instance, we had Challenge of the Masters, Gordon Liu, and also we had Drunken Master, Jackie Chan, and we also had various other versions in the late 1970s. And then leading up to Tsui Hark and Tsui Hark's decision to want to tackle the character in his own version or reinterpretation or homage to the character in the form of Jet Li. And so here we have then the beginning of what becomes that cycle of films, starting with the 1991 work Once Upon a Time in China. But Tsui Hark in this discussion mentions Kwon Tak-hing and how iconic Kwon Tak-hing is. And so This is, I think, a name that will appear many, many times throughout the course of this set. Tony Rayns will mention Kwon King a lot in his discussion. Kwon King also is mentioned a lot in the great booklet essays that are included. I should mention right now, I will talk about it in another video, but for instance, there's a great essay by Grady Hendrix called Life of a Legend, A Brief History of Wong Fei-hung on Screen, and he does mention the Kwon King films to a certain extent, and that is a brilliant discussion. It's one of the best essays of the year, I might say, and so please check out that essay, as well as I should mention the other great essay by Maggie Lee called Past Master, which is also part of this booklet. But in any event, this is again to remind us how Wong Fei-hung as a character, as a cinematically represented character, is a character that has been through so many versions, or so many films, I should say, primarily in the form of the performance by Kwon King. But now we have this, in many ways, a type of radical or new interpretation or version of the character. And indeed, there's another supplement that will be occurring in the later disc. I think it's for part 4. It's with the editor, Marco Mack, and he actually mentions how for him, when he was first working on the project Once Upon a Time in China, the first film, it took him a little while to get used to the idea of Jet Li as Wong Fei-hung, because in his mind the association with Wong Fei-hung and the actor Kwon King was so strong that to have Jet Li fill the shoes, it took some getting used to, but prior to the film being completed, he was able to get used to it. And indeed, when the film was released, Jet Li became Wong Fei-hung for a new generation of fans who were either beginning to know about Wong Fei-hung or wanted to see new versions of Wong Fei-hung on screen, TV, or films, etc. And of course, Jet Li's performance in the first 3 films, plus Once Upon a Time in China and America, are iconic, and they solidified his status as a martial arts superstar, megastar, as well as being one of the key performers of the Wong Fei-hung character. And I should mention too that in 4 and 5, we have the great performance by Vincent Zhao filling the shoes of Wong Fei-hung, and also indeed in many ways taking over Jet Li, and also his work in the subsequent TV series during this time, the mid-90s as well. But Vincent Zhao's performance is also so great, and it adds a different dynamic to the character of Wong Fei-hung, and I think it reminds us how this character Wong Fei-hung has been portrayed in so many versions and so many different performances, primarily, of course, or perhaps in terms of quantity, Kwon King, of course, but we've also seen different versions. I should point out too, for anyone who's interested, you probably know this already, but Yuen Woo-ping's work Drunken Master has Jackie Chan in the role of Wong Fei-hung, and it's a very radical, different interpretation of the character. It's a very interesting one as well. But in any event, we have different iterations or different versions, and not least of which, of course, is being in many ways the iconic version that is portrayed by Jet Li in these films, and then of course Vincent Zhao in 4 and 5, and then other iterations of it as well that followed. So but Tsui Hark's discussion here and his reverence to Kwon King and what he brought to the role in so many films, again close to 80, over the course of from 1949 on into the 70s, is just it can't be stated enough just how important that is. And I'm so glad he brought it up. He brings it up with affection, and also he shows us the type of filmmaker he is in this discussion, Tsui Hark, in that he has this great respect and reverence for what came before, the past and tradition, and also he's trying to put a spin on it, a kind of interpretation or reinterpretation. In many ways, his cinema philosophy, as embodied or exemplified in this particular discussion, is in many ways tied to that very spirit or soul or debate between tradition and modernity or modernism that we see play itself out directly in the film Once Upon a Time in China. And Tsui Hark shows how he can adapt and he can take things from the past and respect them, but at the same time put a new spin on them, which is what he did with this film from '91. And he also explains in this conversation how he wants to explore the maybe contradictions of the character, maybe explore the humanity of the character, show the frustration as well as the heroism. That's to borrow a phrase from Tsui Hark in this interview. The idea too how this is mirroring or paralleling the notion of the clash between tradition and modernity. And this is a very key point too. Again, he respects the performances of Kwon Tak-king, but at the same time we have to remember, or we are told, that the Kwon Tak-king performance of Wong Fei-hung is for the most part a very noble, upstanding figure, which is very much the personification of the Confucian ideal. And one of the themes of Tsui Hark's Wong Fei-hung series is we have the embodiment of the nobility of the Confucian ideal as exemplified by Jet Li's performance as Wong Fei-hung. However, over the course of, say, this film, and indeed the films to follow, we see how this strict nobility is either, maybe not eroding is the wrong word, but is giving way to a type of maybe individual spirit or humanity, almost to the point of stripping Wong Fei-hung, his character, of those very ideals and seeing what he can do with what is remaining. And we see the extreme of that, say, in the sixth film, Once Upon a Time in China and America. And we will talk about that when we get to that particular film. But I think we see the beginnings of that here. And how Tsui Hark is mentioning that in the context of the tradition versus modernity context, I think is really wonderful. He also talks about Jet Li and his performance. An interesting detail emerges. Jet Li was in his late 20s at the time of making this film. This is 1991. And if we remember, the setting of this film is 1875, that makes Jet Li, at the time of his making the film, the same age as Wong Fei-hung would have been at the time of the story of the film, so 28 years of age. And that's a really, really cool detail to keep in mind. And also he mentions, Tsui Hark mentions how Jet Li was injured during some key filming of this particular film, Once Upon a Time in China. And indeed, in one of the other supplements that's included as part of this set, this first disc, we actually see some behind-the-scenes footage. It's very short, but among that you can actually note how his leg is bandaged up, Jet Li's leg is bandaged up. So just so many wonderful things. I should mention too also that Tsui Hark talks about the use of camera, the idea of budgetary constraints leading to choices of camera movement, the type of romanticism that's involved, the sweeping camera, which is part of the style, the idea too of shadows, the shadow play. The idea of shadows is used quite affectionately, especially in the context of the relationship, the romantic relationship aspects between Rosamund Kwan's 13th aunt and Wong Fei-hung. And there's, in particular in some of the films to follow, there's some lovely shadow on the walls interplay. And indeed, that shadow or silhouette usage comes to play in terms of a heightening of the romantic tension or drama or love triangle, in a manner of speaking, when we get to, say, Once Upon a Time in China 5, and we talk about, say, the 14th aunt and the 13th aunt, the 14th aunt, and Wong Fei-hung, and what is perceived to be, from one of the characters' vantage points anyway, a kind of love triangle through the use of shadow or silhouette. And so this is just a phenomenally charming and wonderful aspect to that type of style, or of that shows substance in Tsui Hark's choice of a cinematic style in this and in other films. And also the idea too about how this is multi-parts. We have to remember that this film, Once Upon a Time in China, stands on its own, but also when we think about it in the context of the other films, this whole cycle of films leading up through 5 and indeed to Once Upon a Time in China and America, this whole cycle is phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. And so this is, I think, just not to mention, of course, how it's dealing with history and culture and the rise of history and the sweep of history, etc. And how the choice of Tsui Hark to situate Wong Fei-hung in the course of the various sweeps of history Sun Yat-sen is mentioned in part 2, for example. We have the rise of intrigue in the very courts of power in Beijing. When we get to the third film, for instance, we have, as I say, the emergence of external forces from abroad and how this is threatening China in many ways, as well as bringing benefits to China. We see it at the very start and the cycle of films in Once Upon a Time in China. We see it carried all the way through, all the way to 5. And indeed, there's an interesting twist on the theme when we get to the 6th film. And so in any event, this idea of situating Wang Fei-hung in the sweep of history is very important too, and that's what makes Tsui Hark's interpretation, I think, very vivid. I should point out too that the essay, or one of the essays, points out that the 1976 TVB production, Wang Fei-hung, with Clifford Choi, also had this idea of situating Wang Fei-hung in the sweep of history. So there's a type of interpretation or reinterpretation. But of course, Tsui Hark brings his own sense of style and panache to this particular interpretation of Wang Fei-hung. So it's a really inspired choice indeed. So I cannot express enough just how wonderful this Tsui Hark one-on-one interview is. So please check it out if you can. And again, it's about 15 minutes. Next, we have a number of, or 2 audio excerpt interviews with Jet Li. One described as being from October 2004, and the other being described as being from February 2005 with David Tadman. And so we don't get any video, but we just get the words. But what Criterion has done is they've edited together these 2 audio interview excerpts, and they've given us these visual interpretations, pictures with also words that are sort of animated as we hear the words of Jet Li speak. This is overall 6 minutes. It's a very fascinating, it's a brief but fascinating insight into Jet Li and his philosophy in terms of his approach to martial arts, because we understand that he is a very, very talented and celebrated and incredibly talented a martial artist, wushu martial artist from mainland before he was discovered, and through that discovery he was later found through those channels that led him to Hong Kong and Golden Harvest, and leading him to work with Raymond Chow, and then of course Tsui Hark in at least the first 3 films in the Once Upon a Time in China series, and then returning for the 6th film, Once Upon a Time in China in America. But here we get a sense of his martial arts and his viewpoint, and how that informs his view on, say, Buddhism and his own philosophy and outlook on life. And it's really, really fascinating, and it reminds us too just how skilled and how absorbed and how focused Jet Li is as a martial artist and as a type of philosopher, as well as a performer, an actor. And we can understand that, or it reminds us just how much soul and philosophy is enveloped in his particular performances. And so this is a great series of interviews, again edited together by Criterion, I think very creatively, and so please check it out if you can. That's not all, because the third supplement on the first disc is also from 2021, and this is called Epic Ambition. This is a one-on-one interview with the great Tony Rayns. This is approximately 30 minutes. This is one of the greats. Whenever you have Tony Rayns on an interview or a Criterion supplement or a commentary track or whatever, you have to check it out. And this is another great example. This interview with Tony Rayns is brilliant. Brilliant. He shows us his expertise and his passion and love and admiration for this cycle of films, and also his knowledge, his deep knowledge about Wang Fei-hung and Quan Tak-king and the cinematic legacy, etc. And also he understands and he's teaching us the historical context and the significance of a film like Once Upon a Time in China in 1991, prior to the lead up to 1997. Also the sweep of history, the sweep of cinema and change, the Hong Kong new wave of the late 70s, early 80s, included in which is Tsui Hark, the career of Tsui Hark, and the convergence of the career of Tsui Hark on the one hand, and the state of Hong Kong martial arts cinema on the other hand, and also the convergence with those elements and the idea of the cinematic legacy of Wang Fei-hung, the character and the historical figure, etc., all combining together to create this almost lightning in a bottle type of thing when we get the films Once Upon a Time in China and all the films in the cycle. So this is a must-see supplement. You have to check it out if you are interested in Asian cinema, if you're interested in Once Upon a Time in China films, if you're interested in Tony Rayns and his take. It is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So, for instance, he reminds us, Tony Rayns does, about the idea, or one of the themes that's set up so brilliantly in the first film, and we will see it develop over the course of all the films, is the idea of setting up the character of Wang Fei-hung as this Confucian ideal, stoicism, and the nobility, but how we see that come into conflict in a very playful and creative way with the idea of emancipation, democracy, individual spirit, and how, in many ways, the character of Wang Fei-hung, as portrayed by Jet Li and Vincent Zhao, how he is, in many ways, almost welcoming these particular changes from a certain point of view. And this can be seen to be a really interesting reinterpretation or difference or change from the earlier interpretations of the Wang Fei-hung character, primarily by Kwang Tak-heng. So this is a really astute observation made by Tony Rayns here about how this particular universe of Wang Fei-hung films fits into the entire canon of hundreds plus interpretations of Wang Fei-hung over the course of cinema from the mid-century onwards. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. And also the idea of the build-up, or the lead-up, I should say, to the key year of 1997. He mentions it later about, Tony Rayns does in the interview, about how, in many ways, this type of historical film, based in the 19th century Qing dynasty, in many ways was an ideal type of means by which Tsui Hark could talk about contemporary themes without necessarily getting too much heat from the censors, as it were. And so the way he could use or transpose or otherwise deal with modern contemporary themes of, say, of crisis, of identity, of uncertainty of the future, of the idea of what happens, external influence versus the internal spirit, and what that means for the philosophy and psychology of the individual spirit. We see that exemplified in the story of Wang Fei-hung and also in the story of China overall. But this is also very much keyed into the discussion of Hong Kong and the mainland. And the relationship between the two. It's not an easy one. It's quite it's a relationship that's filled with unease and uncertainty leading up to 97. And so this is indeed very much deeply connected to this and other films. For instance, in Tony Rayns' discussion, when he talks a little bit about Part 2, in Part 2, we see the emergence of Sun Yat-sen. And so Tony Rayns reminds us about how audiences of the time, the early 90s audiences who were watching Part 2, would have recognized this immediately as being not just the historical figure Sun Yat-sen, but also what his character's inclusion in that film seems to represent in the context of the contemporary setting, and, as I say, the lead up to the key year of 1997 for Hong Kong audiences at the time, which is prior to 97. So that's a really key point. I should point out too that this conversation by Tony Rayns, and indeed the earlier conversation with Tsui Hark, is not focused primarily on the first film, but it's just focusing on overall the cycle of films Once Upon a Time in China, with a lot of focus, I should say, on, say, the first three films. So perhaps it might be worthwhile to watch these supplements after you've seen the whole films, if you are interested. But in any event, you are going to get this wonderful treat from Tony Rayns, Tsui Hark from the earlier supplement, and also Tony Rayns here. Continuing on with the Tony Rayns discussion, he mentions too the sort of the key points of Hong Kong cinema history leading up to 91. For instance, he mentions the idea of the emergence, as I mentioned earlier, of the Hong Kong New Wave film generation, included in which is Tsui Hark, and also how Tsui Hark was early in his career. He was what, to borrow a phrase from Tony Rayns, he had made these maybe angry young man films, but then midway or sometime during the course of this early part of his career, he made a change, and he made more sort of quote unquote family friendly or fare that had its roots also with this idea of tradition and the idea of spectacle and also the idea of entertainment. And then how he wanted to have associations with a more independent film creativity spirit. And so this meant changing his roots from Cinema City to founding the Film Workshop with Shi Nansen, or Nansen Shi, who's also going to be interviewed in a separate supplement on, I think, disc 5 of this particular set. And it's a wonderful supplement. We will talk about that when we talk about Once Upon a Time in China 5. But here we have a new chapter of his work with Nansen Shi and others in that particular Film Workshop environment, leading up to his choice of wanting to make this film Once Upon a Time in China and a story about Wang Fei-hung. And Tony Rayns' observations about Tsui Hark are just brilliant in that he describes Tsui Hark as being a filmmaker that is so concerned on the one hand with traditions and with the wonderful history as expressed through the great cinema past of China and Hong Kong on the one hand. At the same time, Tsui Hark is also interested in reinterpretation. And so paying homage while also giving a new interpretation to something. And this makes him, in many ways, the ideal filmmaker at this point in time to make a film about Wang Fei-hung, which is, on the one hand, is truly iconic figure, as expressed in the Kwon King works, but then putting a new interpretation in the role with Jet Li. And then just the rest is, of course, as I say, history. So that is a great observation by Tony Rayns here. Also, Tony Rayns reminds us about certain biographical details of Tsui Hark, and how maybe that has a lot to do with his other main concern as a filmmaker and artist, which is dealing with or discussing the soul or spirit of what it means to be Chinese. And this is also very much part of the discussion, the thematic discussion and concern of Once Upon a Time in China, the 91 film, and then the films to follow. So in these ways, Tsui Hark was perhaps the perfect filmmaker to tackle the Wang Fei-hung character in this particular mode. And so I'm so glad he makes this connection. Also, Tony Rayns talks about Wang Fei-hung, the historical figure himself, his connections with Foshan. And also this leads into a discussion of Kwon King. And also this leads into the discussion of Jet Li. Why was Jet Li, what was the circumstance that led to Jet Li being cast in this iconic role? And he reminds us too about how Jet Li is from the mainland. He's not from Hong Kong. And so in many ways, this also brings to the table this very interesting nuance between, say, an actor who is portraying a Wang Fei-hung who is, from Foshan and the South, essentially, Canton, right? But here we have the actor from the mainland. And so in many ways, Tony Rayns says here that brought with him perhaps subliminally this idea of this Confucian stoic Confucian nobility that could also be said to be quite stiff and very much to the point of being very rigid. But it was this rigidity that was, I think, in many ways the start of Tsui Hark's vision of Wang Fei-hung, and as he would develop and progress and emerge and evolve over the course of the various films, and how that rigidity would end up essentially giving way to a sense of more, say, flexibility and the like. And so it was really an inspired choice in many respects, not to mention, of course, the fact that Jet Li was and is this high level, top level martial artist. And so, and he brought that energy and vigor and skill to his performance as Wang Fei-hung. in the first three films. I should mention too here that Tony Rayns does mention a little bit about Vincent Zhao, who is in part 4 and 5, and also he emerges as Wang Fei-hung in other films as well, and also in a certain TV series or certain series that emerged in the mid-90s. But here's something where I would say maybe I would have liked to have heard more from Tony Rayns about, which is Tony Rayns talks about Vincent Zhao very briefly, and how for him, Tony Rayns, he thinks it's very natural, the transition between Jet Li by the end of the third film, and then the introduction of Vincent Zhao, the new actor, to portray Wang Fei-hung in part 4, and then subsequently in part 5. And so Tony Rayns says that it's a very natural transition for him. I think Vincent Zhao's performance is brilliant. I really do. But for me, it is a very different mold and approach to the Wang Fei-hung character than Jet Li's performance is. I think not least of which being because there is an actual difference in age of almost 10 years between Jet Li and Vincent Zhao. Vincent Zhao is a little bit younger. And this actually shows in his performance. Not to say anything bad against Jet Li's performance is phenomenal, but Vincent Zhao's performance is also phenomenal, but in a different way. But that means, too, that he brings different dynamics and different character, maybe chemistries. That also explains, I think, why I think the introduction of the 14th aunt character in part 4 and then into part 5, I think helps a little bit in terms of the transition. But I think this becomes a very interesting source of discussion when we see Vincent Zhao's Wang Fei-hung interact with Rosamund Kwan's 13th aunt in part 5. And there is a chemistry that is very different, I would say, than the chemistry had between Jet Li's Wang Fei-hung and the 13th aunt. And so I would have liked to have heard a little bit more from Tony Rayns as to some of these character dynamic changes and how change could also lead to different interpretations, which I believe is the case. There are some changes in character dynamics with the introduction of the new actor, of course, but those changes, I think, add a certain element that make those films 4 and 5 work very well on their own in certain ways. But Tony Rayns doesn't really touch upon those potential character or dynamic differences, which I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about. But suffice to say, however, he does see a very ease of transition between Jet Li and then Vincent Zhao. So, but it's good at least that he mentions a little bit, because there is very little actually throughout the supplements in this entire set. There is very little mention at all about the kind of break between Golden Harvest and Jet Li at the end of 3. Leading to his non-appearance in 4 and 5. And so we don't get, or why he returns in the 6th film, for instance. There isn't a lot of detail about that. There's maybe a slight mention in the Maggie Lee essay, but that's pretty much it. But and there's Tony Rayns mentions a little bit about it in this particular interview. But the point is that I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about that as well. But in any event, continuing on, what I do like too, and just to link it with the Vincent Zhao 4 and 5 films, what I love about the Tony Rayns discussion, and this is linked to one of the key strengths of the Criterion set as well. What I love about the Tony Rayns discussion is that he speaks about the cycle of films 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. He speaks about the 6th film as a type of coda, Once Upon a Time in China and America as a type of coda, but he speaks of the 5 films primarily because he sees the 5 films, not the 3 films, not the trilogy, but he sees the 5 films as being key as showing this type of progress or evolution or variations on the themes of Wang Fei-hung in terms of history, the sweep of history, in terms of East and West, in terms of tradition and modernity, in terms of the role of martial arts and the role of military technology, in terms of the relationships between and among, say, Wang Fei-hung and his disciples, in particular the relationships between Wang Fei-hung and Leung Fun, and also Wang Fei-hung and Clubfoot or Clubfoot 7, whom we will meet in the 3rd film. It's a very key relationship, and also another key relationship is the relationship between Wang Fei-hung and the 13th aunt. And so how these elements, these themes, these relationships, these arcs will progress from 1 to 2 and 3, but they won't stop at 3. They will continue on into 4 and into 5. And he describes the 6th film as a type of coda, but I would actually argue that the 6th film also continues this trend or arc of theme or variations on a theme or progressions or advancements of particular themes that were started all the way back in the first film. Thus, one can consider Once Upon a Time in China and America as indeed a 6th part in the cycle of films. But in any event, what I love about what Tony Rayns is doing here in a very subtle way is he's calibrating or recalibrating the films. It's not a trilogy. They have been often marketed in the past, in prior releases, DVD, Blu-ray releases. They've been often marketed as the Once Upon a Time trilogy. And that's due, I believe, to the appearance of Jet Li in the 3 films, not 4, not 5, but the 3 films, plus the 6th film. But they've always been marketed as a trilogy. But what that does is that it unfortunately, it ignores the significance of 4 and 5. What this set does, and what Tony Rayns recalibrating or reasserting, is the importance of 4 and 5 in the entire series, and then plus the 6th film. And so if we think about it in that way, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant recalibration and a brilliant support of what this set, the Criterion set, is doing. It is called Once Upon a Time in China, the complete films. And what this is referring to is the Tsui Hark interpretation of Wang Fei-hung, the character. And the complete films means it includes 4 and 5. It's not just the trilogy. The trilogy is great. 1, 2, and 3 are great. I love them to bits. But also 4 and 5 are fantastic in their own ways. And so to have those included in the cycle, this is one of the great strengths of Tony Rayns' discussion, and indeed one of the great strengths of the Criterion set overall. So for these and other reasons, my dear friends, the Tony Rayns discussion is phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. So please, please, please check it out if you can. I maybe I've been speaking too much about this, but I really can't contain my excitement about this particular discussion, or the Tsui Hark discussion before, and this discussion. It is just this is a reason. This is an example of why I love the Criterion Collection physical media overall. It's to be able to watch discussions like this and to learn so many things that I didn't know or I didn't realize before, and reminding of things that make these films so significant and so powerful, as well as being these great sources of entertainment and action and fun. So bravo to Tony Rayns and bravo to the Criterion Collection. I mean, it makes me wonder, if they were able to have Tony Rayns commentaries for each of the films, my goodness, that would have, and this set is already through the roof, that would have sent this set in the stratosphere. Oh my goodness, my goodness. But in any event, we don't get any commentary tracks from Tony Rayns or others, but at least we get this great interview. So please check it out if you can. And then continuing on, we have a 7-minute discussion with the great Yan Xi-Quan. This appeared in other releases prior to Criterion, but I'm glad Criterion included this. Again, this is 7 minutes. Yan Xi-Quan plays Master Yim in the first film. It's a key role, but here he's talking briefly about his career as a martial artist and also as a maybe choreographer as well as a performer. Working with the Shaw brothers, the physicality of his roles, injuries, working with others, etc., working with Jackie Chan, working with Jet Li, etc., styles, working with the styles of different actors that he's performing with. His favorite role, he mentions Once Upon a Time in China. As I should say, the Master Yim is a key role, is a key character in Once Upon a Time in China, and it's not just a role that is a type of maybe antagonist role, or it's not really a villain role, but it's a type of antagonist role because, as I say, he is on a collision course with Wang Fei-hung in terms of the philosophy of martial arts, and it's the martial arts rivalry at stake here in terms of the first film. But it's not just an antagonist role, but it's also a role about an example of this philosophical or spiritual expression of martial arts and what it means in the context of the emerging military technological might that is just on the horizon, that is threatening or potentially threatening the very foundational philosophy of martial arts overall, and what Master Yim seems to be, what choice he seems to be making versus the choices that Wang Fei Hung seems to be making. And that is also a clash. It's not just a physical clash, but it's also a philosophical clash between these two characters, which makes his character so key in the context of Once Upon a Time in China. And indeed, it sets up the theme that we will see play out in the rest of the film. So wonderful for Criterion for being able to include this. Again, it was from previous releases, but it's great to have it now here as well. And then to continue with the supplements, we have another supplement, which is a short, about 2 minutes, behind the scenes. This is also included elsewhere, but it's also great to see it here. We see just some shots of a particular sequence that it's a type of a climactic sequence as well, involving ladders, and it's an iconic sequence in the film, but it's great to have this behind the scenes. I mentioned earlier you can actually see instances where Jet Li is injured, because it reminds us that he indeed injured himself during shooting. So, but it's another brief but insightful thing to see. Again, great that Criterion was able to re-include it as part of its own release here. And then finally, to round out the supplements, we have the trailer for the film Once Upon a Time in China. So that is a sort of roundup of my thoughts about the first disc, Once Upon a Time in China. I think I've spoken quite a lot, and I apologize if I've done so, but I can't. It's very difficult for me to contain my excitement when it comes to this particular set, as exemplified in the first disc. I do acknowledge that there are weaknesses, as shown in the first disc, and those weaknesses, I think, can be said to be extending throughout the entire set overall. But I do want to emphasize that this first disc also shows why this set from Criterion is so strong the way it is. And what it's doing is it's showing the context of this film, Once Upon a Time in China, and also seeing how it's calibrating or recalibrating the importance of this film in the context of the entire cycle of films. It's not just the trilogy, but it's the cycle of films, 4, 5, and indeed 6 from a certain point of view. So well done to Criterion and to Tony Rayns and Tsui Hark and others for being able to do this. Also, I should point out too, and this is probably going to be maybe more significant in the discussion of the other supplements on the discs, in particular maybe the supplements that we found on disc 2 for Once Upon a Time in China 2, and I'll get to that later. But one of the things too that this set is doing is it's also celebrating and respecting the legacy of Tsui Hark in the context of Once Upon a Time in China. And so it's really showing, and there's a real emphasis and focus on Tsui Hark as a filmmaker. And as I say, there is a very interesting link between an early work that he was involved in from the 70s, a documentary dealing with New York Chinatown that we will talk about in a later disc, and how that is actually, it can be said to be quite significantly tied with something that we will see in Once Upon a Time in China and America on the 6th disc. And so this in many ways is a type of almost circular, wonderfully circular way in which these discs, starting with the first disc, is a type of celebration and recognition of the importance of Tsui Hark's contribution to these cycle of films. He is a director for the most part. There are a number of instances where he wasn't director, but he was always involved in sort of the producer or creative process to one degree or another. And so to have his maybe legacy be recognized in this way on disc 1 and the discs to follow, it's a wonderful way that this set by Criterion is also respecting that so well. This is great. I mean, I'm so sorry too, I didn't mention the great contributions of the other artists in question when it comes to this film. For instance, I didn't mention the great music, James Wong music, or I didn't mention the great theme, George Lamb's theme that begins the titles, and we will actually hear that. It won't be the last time we hear this great version of the theme song. And we also know that the theme song is also a link to the early it's a link to the past as well, as far as when it was first heard, in terms of it's often referred to as the general's mandate or the general's orders, or on the general's orders, the name of the song, but then it was readapted or adapted or reinterpreted to become this this Cantonese pop song, a super cool Cantonese pop song performed by George Lam. It's often translated into English as "a man should strengthen himself" or "a man should better himself." And so this is a key aspect. Again, it's the idea of respecting the past, but also reinterpreting it for a new generation. And that is kind of the key philosophical and cinematic philosophy of Tsui Hark, as exemplified in the very first film, Once Upon a Time in China, and in the musical choice. And also, I didn't mention either the great contributions of the martial artists. I mean, I mentioned a little bit about Jet Li, but we didn't mention, for instance, Lau Kar-wing and Yuan Wo-ping, and also Yuan Chengyang and Yuan Xunyi, who are Yuan Wo-ping's siblings, and also their relationship with their father, Simon Yuan, and also Lau Kar-wing, and also not credited, but Lau Kar-wing's sibling, which is Lau Kar-yong, and also their father as well, Lao Chem, and how their lineage, not just in terms of the martial arts, but their lineage to the past incarnations, Quan Ta King, and the cinematic legacy of Quan Ta King, and the cinematic representations of Wang Fei Hung are very important. Also, Lao Chem, in terms of he played. He was also very instrumental in terms of the lineage, linking the lineage right back to Wang Fei Hung, not just in terms of his involvement in the early films from the 50s, the Quan Ta King films, where he played one of the disciples, Lam Sai Wing, but also he was a disciple of Lam Sai Wing, who himself was a disciple of Wang Fei Hung, and so the disciple is portrayed in the film, the first film, as Butcher Wing. The Kent Cheng character, and so that lineage is just so powerful. And indeed, also we didn't mention too. It's one of the great things about the set. The Grady Hendrix essay, for example, which I mentioned earlier, talks about, for example, the other past versions of Wang Fei Hung in cinema, Challenge of the Masters, etc. Lau Kar-leung and his involvement in this sort of thing, and also Yuan Wo-ping and his involvement with directing the film Drunken Master with Jackie Chan, who himself played Wang Fei Hung. And in fact, I mentioned the George Lam song, "A man should better himself or strengthen himself," which is based on General's orders. And we actually hear Jackie Chan's rendition of this film in We Will Hear It Elsewhere. And so in any event, there are so many connections between and among, say, the Quan Ta King legacy, and also Wang Fei Hung, and also Butcher Wing, and also the like. And so these and other reasons, I think, what makes these films so fascinating. And again, it all comes from this film from 1991. So exciting, so electrifying, and it's so wonderful that we have it included here in this great set from Criterion. It is a set that it's not without fault or weakness. I do acknowledge that. But as I say, overall, it is a super, super strong set. It's a super, super strong set that I think for anyone who is into sort of completeness when it comes to Once Upon a Time in China, I think it goes along on the shelf together with other versions or other releases in the past of the Once Upon a Time in China films, but also it stands on its own so well for some of the reasons that I tried to hint at right now, and we will try to go into more detail into in the video discussions to follow. But in any event, my friends, this is a discussion of the first disc of this set, Once Upon a Time in China, the complete films, and that first disc is focusing in on the film from 91, Tsui Hark's film, Once Upon a Time in China, Wang Fei Hung. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.